death becomes fun, and sometimes funny.
Oh.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. I do recall, like, the first time you dropped an ATM on somebody by accident, it was, like, a big deal, right?
Yeah.
Especially because it was accidental.
Yeah.
I do recall that, yeah. I do, yeah, that is a good point, right? They allowed things to have impact. And the thing is, like, I also think it's possible for there to be stories where you're allowed to make things like that trivial, but there still has to be some kind of impact, right? You're setting up a world when you set up a story.
Yeah.
So when you set up a world like, Breaking Bad, then, like, given that it is this kind of exploration, then it makes sense that the death of someone should be a big deal. When you look at something like, for instance, Preacher, the show I watched a while ago and started rewatching recently, the death of someone is actually no big deal at all.
Okay.
But at the same time, when something happens to one of the main characters, that is a big deal. There is a weight to things happening. It's just not like it's the kind of show where consequences are not the same. Right? You're building a world when you build this kind of show, and there has to be like a narrative to it, or at least there has to be like a narrative weight to certain events, which is what some shows are missing and why they feel so lackluster.
Yeah.
Yeah, there has
Or
to be.
also there has to be some thought as to, again, I guess the character, right? Like the thing that continues to sort of upset me about Breaking Bad is that, like, you have this moment with the DEA agent character Hank, where I guess they were doing this like super hard Moby Dick trope or something, and he just does a bunch of like super dumb shit, like go after who was basically the biggest drug kingpin in the area with like no backup and with no like evidence stashed away somewhere. Like, I don't know. You know that he's a smart guy, and you know that he's been in more than one tussle. You know that he's been through quite a few things, but all of a sudden he becomes a dumbass. Like,
Yeah, it's never good when your character has to hold the idiot ball for the plot to progress.
yeah, and that's exactly what it felt like. I was like, you built this person up to be such an interesting character. Why you gotta do that? Like, why does that have to be where it goes?
Yeah, I definitely understood. Yeah. That's just bad character writing at the end of the day. It happens to everybody to some degree, but yeah, like, your characters have to make sense. They have to be internally consistent.
Kratos is very consistent.
Yeah, what he does is murder things. But
Uh-huh.
he's also not a complicated character. That's the thing.
He consistently murders things, though.
Yeah, it's kind of like old school Superman wasn't a complicated character, but like new school Superman kind of is.
Yeah.
Like
That's
some
true.
characters are consistent in their characterization, but it makes them simple. But simple is not bad because again, like a character is a tool to tell a story. So the question is, what story are you telling? Batman is a simple character. That's okay because Batman's just the solution to the problem. It's the Joker that's complex. That's all right.
Mm.
That's okay. Like all of Batman's villains were very interesting, but we kind of needed this static hero to come in and end the situation at the end to allow us to move on, and that's why Batman doesn't really have a lot of dynamism.
But why don't they make it so the bad guys win?
Because then people are sad.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that really it?
I mean, mostly, yeah. I remember that a lot of these things are tested and focus grouped. And unfortunately, when executives for these kinds of shows focus group something, they don't ask, how do you feel about it a month after you watched it, or was this emotionally impactful? They ask questions like, what did you think of this ending? And they get feedback like, it made me sad. And they were like, okay, guys, they didn't like this. We got to change it. Am I going back the way I came? I'm going back the way I came. And this leads to very bland and boring stories, right? But yeah, I mean, I guess on the other side, you run the risk of being too dark, and when you're too dark, the dark stops mattering. That was the what I like to think of as the Game of Thrones problem. If you are too dark too much of the time, death no longer matters, right? Darkness no longer matters. Shows like Preacher deal with that by making it not dark. Death becomes fun, and sometimes funny.
All right. Well, that's definitely an interesting direction. I would not have thought of that.
But like, that's the thing, right? Making it a moment of levity then makes, when it happens to a character and it is dark, serious, because it's not always dark, so it's serious when it is dark. Whereas, like, if you're always grim dark, then the show goes, look at this horrible, awful, dark thing, isn't this bad? And you go, yeah, but like the last 15 things you showed me were bad. Like, is this really that bad?
I don't think Game of Thrones got too like. I don't think the problem with Game of Thrones was that it got too dark though. I think the problem was that all of a sudden, like all the dark bits, I don't know, seemed to fit, and then all of a sudden they didn't, and it wasn't dark enough or something.
I
And
mean, this is why like, my theory is that it got too dark, and that's my way of I guess thinking about that, because the way that I thought about Game of Thrones was that you look at like the beginning of Game of Thrones, like season one. Season one was great. I loved season one. There's only one major character death in season one, and that one major character death was
so good.
ludicrous, like mind bending, like holy
I could
crap! How
not
can this
believe it
happen?
when I saw it.
Exactly.
I was shocked.
I mean, really though, like absolutely whoa, right? I mean, hella whoa moment. The problem is that then we get to the point where these deaths become so common that they no longer affect us that much. So we instead have to make the death itself darker. And like, okay, fine. At the same time, though, like that just means that your character deaths are no longer as meaningful because we've gotten to the point where they're commonplace. And like as a result, you have to go darker and darker to get the same effect because like why would you oh, I have to do a thing.
You have to do the thing.
Yeah, there you go. I already did it.
I think it was L1, R1 at the same time.
Oh. Okay, cool. I pressed L1 and R1 at the same time, Atreus. Weren't you paying attention?
He is so impressed though.
God. Yeah, like I feel like that was the problem, is that as much as it may have made sense that things went haywire, at the same time things went haywire too often, and as a result it stopped being a serious emotional moment and started being the predictable outcome of every situation.
Oh yeah, you're just like, what's the worst thing that can happen? Oh,
That's what's gonna happen. Yeah, exactly, right. And that's the problem, is that when there's no hope, despair has no meaning. Right? It's the same thing as how they tell you that if you really want to write a good horror story, you need moments of levity. If you really want to write a good comedy, you need moments of near tragedy. And these are because the greater the contrast, the greater you feel those emotions, whereas you kind of have emotion fatigue when you watch a story and it's the same thing over and over again. And that's just not how you build a good emotional journey, you know? So yeah, like season 1 Game of Thrones, phenomenal. By the time we got to the point where it took the Red Wedding to be shocking, a character death was no longer meaningful.
I was still super into it at the Red Wedding.
I was less into it, but still there. You know, like I was still definitely into it, just not as into it as I was. I still think season 1 may have been my favorite season. But like by the end, it was ludicrous, right? And like and now they've got a spin-off series run by the same people, and I was like, did you guys have a different opportunity you wanted to pursue, and then it didn't work out? Because like that's kind of what it feels like. You screwed the big story, The Whale, and now you're coming back to do a spin-off? Why does anyone care if you screwed up the big story,
Yeah.
man?
I'm so not invested.
Exactly.
I'm sure somebody will
Now
watch
you're
it.
fighting uphill. Like, why do this, right?
Do you think people are going to watch it, though?
Oh, yeah. There are some people who would watch anything in that series, right? But think about the fandom bell curve, right? How much of that bell curve is going to be watching that series? Is it the third, what do you call it? The distribution? Is it going to be like that last 3%? Or is it going to be like a significant portion of the fandom?
Standard deviation.
There you go, yeah. Is it going to be like the third standard deviation, or is it going to be a significant portion of that bell curve?
Yeah, I think,
I would be willing
it's
to bet
only
it's
going to
the
be the
last one.
most fanatical.
Exactly. This is how I feel about it, right? There will always be that last little portion that is so wildly interested in the story, they will watch anything about it. That does not mean that it's a good story, or that you should make the story this way. It doesn't mean anything, actually.
You think the
part
Lord of the
fandom
Rings
is much
series is
older.
going to be any good?
I'm hoping so, but I'm already seeing some issues with the fandom. So here's my take on it. I would love to see a Lord of the Rings series personally, because I feel like Lord of the Rings is rife for a series. It's exactly the kind of book that you can make a great series out of. The problem is that the fandom is very strict about things remaining exactly as they were in the book,
Yeah.
which really makes no sense, because the book was very of its time. It was written during a specific time period. If you want a show to be widely accepted now, and not only accepted by its existing fandom, which is certainly how I feel, right? I would rather there be more Lord of the Rings fans than fewer Lord of the Rings fans.
Okay.
But for this to be the case, we need to accept that updates need to be made to bring the story in line with modern storytelling and modern ethos. But the fandom will never allow this to happen.
Yeah, you have to be careful because like so much of that Lord of the Rings is so densely interwoven. The characters have multi-thousand year histories, like all that insane crap. So yeah, I think it requires a substantial amount of thoughtfulness if you're gonna start tinkering with it, just because of how much one thing from thousands of years ago builds up onto another thing, you know?
I mean, that's fair, but like at the same time, written as it is now, you're gonna have a limited audience. The fact is, like at the end of the day, The Lord of the Rings is a dated story the way it's told. It was the very first one. You know, it was the first fantasy story of its type. Of course it's dated. And the simple truth is that, like, you know, at the end of the day, it's not only dated, it's also problematic, right? I would be unwilling to support a completely faithful iteration of Lord of the Rings. Because, frankly, the totally faithful version of Lord of the Rings was very racist.
But like you can get people to consult with if you're going to write. You know what I mean? Like there are people that studied Tolkien that would be like, you can't do this over here because of XYZ, like 9 other things or whatever.
This is fair, right? And look, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. I am saying that maybe we should accept that not all elves were blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and maybe they weren't superhuman. Maybe not all dwarves were stereotypes. Maybe not all orcs are evil. Maybe not all dark-skinned humans are on the bad guy's side. These are updates that would make it much easier to bear in a modern setting, and frankly, would make the story easier to support overall. But from my perspective, and the way that I feel about it, is that a black elf would not substantially change the context of The Lord of the Rings. It, in my opinion, simply would not. Even though in the eyes of a lot of fans, it would harm the story because this is simply not the way it was described in the book. And this is where I feel there's a problem, right? I think that in order for a story to be good, you have to let it be updated. For Lord of the Rings right now, that means, yeah, let's get rid of the racist elements. Let's maybe not have an Aryan race in the book. Let's maybe allow dark-skinned people to be good also. Let's maybe let some white people not be the heroes. Yeah. Let's just update those parts of the story. Let's maybe let female characters have more of a role, right? Éowyn is great. Love Éowyn. Other female characters could also do more in the context of the story.
Yeah, I think they did a clever job giving Arwen more to do also.
Right? It's how I feel.
But then again, they had this moment where they were considering bringing Arwen to Helm's Deep or something.
But they chose not to, yeah.
You know, and it's like, okay. But then they sent the elves to Helm's Deep.
That was only because they wanted Arwen there. This I think is a movie problem decision, by which I mean that basically there was like a vestigial like scene in the movie where thematically, if Arwen had been there, it would have been out of line with the books and a little strange, but like I can kind of understand where they were going. The problem is they decided later on that they shouldn't do that, but then like they've already got scenes with elves in them at Helm's Deep, so what do you do?
And then it doesn't make sense.
Right. It's very silly.
The other missed opportunity that I thought was there was, I don't remember when the Dunedain, so like all the Rangers of the North show up at one point, and it's either when they're on their way to Pelennor, or at Helm's Deep. I can't remember which it is. But like, what an awesome opportunity, right? That they show up to help Aragorn out. Like,
absolutely, yeah. And like, you could absolutely do some really cool things with that too. I like that, you know what, the Lord of the Rings battle game, actually, the tabletop one, did something really interesting with that.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, so in Lord of the Rings battle game, heroes have properties that normal troops don't. I won't get into the exact rules. That's the case, right? Heroes have properties normal troops don't.
That makes sense.
The Dunedain Rangers, if you take nothing but them and no like normal troops, just nothing but the Rangers, every single one of them is a hero. Every single one.
Nice.
All of them. So even though they're expensive, so they are inevitably completely outnumbered, every single one of them is a hero, and that gives them this huge advantage in some situations that makes them really feel heroic, right? They can stand against an entire other army, even though there's fewer of them, because every single one of them is a hero in their own right.
Nice.
Like, that's so badass, right? And this is how it should have felt in the show. This would have given context to Aragorn, both in why it is that Aragorn is a badass, and also allowed Aragorn to show up a few of the Rangers and prove that he is particularly proficient even among them. And this would have given Aragorn context in two ways, which I really like personally.
Or show that he's not the best fighter, but maybe the best leader or something. That
Right.
also would have been
the
nice.
Master Chief complex. Yeah, it's a really good way to do it. Yeah. You know, maybe
Yeah.
he has more heart. I don't know, but like, there are ways to do this, right? But like, yeah, they chose instead to bring the elves for Arwen's sake. Then they chose not to have Arwen, and that just didn't make any sense.
Yeah, and again, like all the elves are going to the west. Why are they there?
Right.
You know, like for them, this is like so last century. You know,
Yeah.
these idiots are still squabbling over some dumb crap. I don't know. Whatever, man. I'm going to paradise. I'll check you later, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, why were they there? It's kind of cool to see them fight with humans side by side again. I mean, that was kind of cute, but still, I don't know. Somehow it didn't land for me.
Yeah, it didn't for me either, to be honest. But that's just the way they wrote the story, right? But yeah, I don't know. I still feel like that was just vestigial from when they were doing something else, and they just kind of had to keep it, and it didn't make a lot of sense. But all right, but yeah, like I guess I don't feel like Arwen necessarily needed to be there for that fight, but it still would have been cool if there were more significant female characters.
Yeah.
You know, and especially because a lot of people go, but Eowyn. I'm like, right, but you have to point out the one, and this is exactly the problem. You know, you don't point out the one male hero in Lord of the Rings, but you do point out the one female hero, you know?
I think they did a bit more of that. A bit more in the Hobbit.
They
Like,
did, yeah.
They did not make the dwarves lame at all, you know, which I thought was great. Like,
Yeah,
they seem so badass in some moments.
Yeah, they made them, like, genuinely heroic. They made them absolutely badass. I still think Thorin was made, like, one of the coolest people in the show. And, like, in the end, he's played on the tabletop version for that reason now. It even looks like his movie counterpart, because that was, like, the most badass version of Thorin, you know?
Yeah.
So, like, they absolutely made them badass, 1,000%.
I also liked their treatment of Galadriel.
Hmm.
So, like, she's the reason Sauron is not, you know, in whatever his corporeal form, however that whole thing worked out.
Yeah.
Like, she was the badass that did that.
And I mean, that's fair, right? Because Galadriel and all the people with Rings of Power, especially the elves with Rings of Power, had a huge impact. We just don't see it a lot in the version of the movies that we have, right?
Yeah.
Maybe, see, this is the kind of thing that I think a show would be able to expand on. Shows have more real estate in terms of screen time than movies do. They can do things like show you why it is the Rings of Power are actually interesting or helpful. They can show you why it is that the people who have them are actually significant. They can show you what it is that happened to the dwarves and the humans who had them and the tragedy of the ring wraiths as opposed to just making them faceless bad guys. They could have enough time to really discuss what it is that makes the world what this world is, maybe explain the Valar a bit. Because this is something that always bugged me, right? Whenever I have to explain to someone Lord of the Rings, I have to explain to them all the things that were not in the movies. And I've had this conversation with people so many times. I was like, yeah, but like Gandalf the White actually does make perfect sense, and it's a great moment. You just don't understand the context, and the context is the Valar. And they go, what the hell is a Valar? Right. This is the kind of thing that maybe the show could resolve.
Unless you're Stephen Colbert.
Well, yeah, but Stephen Colbert is a freaking Lord of the Rings scholar at this point. You know, so like you don't get to count Stephen at this point.
Yeah.
Like that's exactly what I mean, right? I want more Lord of the Rings fans. With there to be more Lord of the Rings fans, more people have to be able to experience and like the story, and that means more context.
I just think it's hard to get right.
Yeah, well, it will
No matter
always
what
be.
it is you're trying to do, I think it's hard to get right.
Yeah, there's no way to get a story like that exactly right nowadays anymore. And that's just because, like, you know, you're going to piss somebody off, right? You're either going to modernize it, which will make new fans happy and potentially get you new fans, but will change the context, or you're not going to modernize it, you're going to stick to the existing fan base and new fans won't care. But this is the risk you take.
I mean, I think also just within either of those paths, there's so much variance. You know, like I think it's hard to execute something like that well, independent of all of the other factors, you know?
Yeah, I guess that's true.
And so whether or not you're going to change things, like it's still hard to get it right.
That's very
or like
true.
or to get it right enough for it to be interesting. Like
Very true.
I don't know, it's nothing is perfect obviously. So everybody celebrates the yeah, I guess the Peter Jackson interpretation of like Lord of the Rings. I absolutely love them, you know.
Right. Yeah.
But they're not perfect.
No. but nobody else is ambitious enough to take on that project, you know?
And it really is unbelievably hard to do well.
Do I chuck something at those?
Yeah, you gotta get them all down within a limited period of time or something. So I guess at the beginning of the game is a bit easier. Maybe there's not much of a time limit, but later on it's like...
Where's the last one?
Oh, I do not remember this game at all.
Yeah, like maybe the show will fix that, but yeah, like
I
it was
don't
a
know.
great undertaking. I love the way he did it, the stories, the lore of the way he did it, the making ofs, the crazy ambition, all of that, all great. But yeah, like maybe the show will have more time, and as a result, can tell the story a slightly different way. But yeah, like, I mean, I don't think you're wrong. It's incredibly difficult to do something like that right, no matter what you do. But personally, I've always been a fan of stories being allowed to change. I feel like that's how you keep a story alive. You allow it to change to the modern zeitgeist. You allow the people who make it to put their heart and soul into it, which will make it a passion project. And you enjoy that there is now a new version of the story as well as the old. And there's just more iterations of this story out there now. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, it could work. It's just, it has to work, you know?
Yeah.
And that's the critical factor, you know?
It's not going to be easy. I mean,
No.
The Wheel of Time just tried to do it, and I'm not going to say it was a bad show. It wasn't. Certainly wasn't perfect, but like, you know, that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
You know, at least they're trying, right? At least they're making an attempt at more Lord of the Rings. Yeah, as I said, like, I really hope this show kind of addresses some of the more problematic elements that make me feel a little guilty about liking it now. And then I'll feel a little better. But we just gotta accept that, like, Lord of the Rings was also flawed. It was not as perfect as people seem to think. Like, I spent years defending the eagle argument, only to find out that he had said in an interview that the actual answer is that it hadn't occurred to him. Like, it's not a perfect story.
Really?
Yeah.
But
Aerial combat was new at the time. It just was not a thing that occurred to him as easily as it occurred to modern people. That's all it was.
okay, I do think you can excuse it though with the whole Nazgul thing.
There's a dozen ways you can excuse it, right? There's the fact that that the Nazgul exist. There's the fact that there are ballistas, archers, and a million other ways for them to be shot down if they just try to fly over Mordor. There's the fact that the Mordor air itself is toxic and the Eagles may not have been fond of that.
Yeah.
There's the fact that there are politics involved and the Eagles may simply not have wanted to get involved. There's a dozen ways you can try to explain it, but the honest truth is that he just didn't think of it, right? So we have to accept that he wasn't a flawless writer. Like, this happened.
No, but I do think he was exceptionally thoughtful. You know,
was.
and I, like, in a world where I feel like a lot of series are these fast food type, let's just see how many seasons we can string people along type things.
Yeah.
You know, it's nice to see that he completed a small number of stories and, I mean, despite their flaws, like, actually thought things through. You know what I mean? Like, actually thought things. There's an end to this story, and it looks like this. This character is here because of A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And not that it's a bad idea to update that. I think that's totally fine. But just things have to actually work. Which is why I was so pleasantly surprised with Cowboy Bebop, because I felt like, as I was watching it, the things that they changed, and I'm sure there's so many people that are like would disagree with me on this, but I felt like
1000%.
the things that they changed, like the characters that they cast, the changes in the costumes, like everything just okay. The one thing that I thought didn't work was there's a super anime-y kind of character, and like I don't see how anybody's gonna do that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like in real life, there's some characters that I feel like they just belong in the world of animation. But somehow, you know, the changes that they made just seem to work.